So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Gundula Loeffler. I'm a research fellow at the ODI Development and Public Finance Program. And today, what I would like to present to you is based on some of ODI's recent research and technical assistance work, specifically in Uganda. Here, I'm drawing particularly on two pieces of work that were recently finalized around the equity of intergovernmental transfers and service delivery, as well as on a piece of work we did together with NYU Wagner School of Public Service on challenges of subnational health financing. And then, of course, on various pieces of research and analysis that have been conducted in the context of our technical assistance work, long-term technical assistance work in Uganda. All right, so let me begin with a little bit of context first. So Uganda has a devolved system of governance with two tiers of government, the national government level and local government level, which consists of districts in rural areas and municipal city councils in urban areas. This is often referred to as the LC5 level. Below these, there are also, the local government is further subdivided into other subnational units, county, sub-county, parish, and village, etc. But these are all part of the local government framework. As part of its decentralization reform, Uganda has devolved a range of service delivery functions to local governments, of which there are currently 176 units, local governments. These delivery functions are in a range of sectors in health, education, water and sanitation, agriculture, trade and industry, public works and transport. So, but in most of these sectors, only some of the functions were devolved to local governments, while others have been retained by national government, as is the case in many countries as well, many other countries. Just to give an illustration, for example, in health, local governments are usually responsible for the district health centers, as well as the district hospitals, as well as the health centers 1 to 4, while the Ministry of Health retains responsibility for the 2 national hospitals and the 14 regional referral hospitals. With regards to financing, so subnational service delivery is financed through a range of various funding streams. The most important one is the intergovernmental fiscal transfer system. These are grants or transfers that are mostly conditional by sector, but there's also some discretionary funding in there included. Then there are so-called subventions, which are government transfers specifically for vertical spending programs. And then, of course, there's a lot of donor funding that goes into the different sectors, some of it which is on budget, others is off budget. And then, of course, to a much smaller extent, but there's also some local on-source revenue that is going towards financing service delivery at the local level. There may be two characteristics of the intergovernmental system in Uganda that are worth highlighting here, as they have an important bearing on how the system functions. One is a recent movement towards decentralization in Uganda. So Uganda's initial decentralization reform, which started in the mid-90s, entailed some quite extensive devolution. It was all about empowering the grassroots, which possibly overwhelmed the local government level that wasn't quite equipped to deal with all these new responsibilities. So in order to ensure good performance in service delivery. There have been, over time, over the last 10 years, the central government reintroduced certain measures that in their totality can be seen as a move towards decentralization. Some of these are, for example, that the intergovernmental transfers and other grants have been increasingly earmarked. The use has been specifically defined as opposed to leaving the use open to local governments, for local governments to decide. Another measure was the re-centralization or retransfer of certain functions that were originally devolved to the local level back to national government agencies. One example here is, for example, drug procurement. And a third measure is that certain intergovernmental transfers that used to flow through the local government budgets, they still flow through the budgets, but the money went originally to local governments and were then handed on to facilities. They now go directly from the National Treasury to the facilities. So this is this recentralization movement is one thing to keep in mind in the context of Uganda. The other one is the continuous proliferation of local government units, which has been happening, for a long time now. We're currently at 176 local governments, as I mentioned. If you read literature from just a few years ago, you will see numbers like 115, 14 or so. So it's something that's continuously happening. The number of local governments is growing, and as a result, the new local governments, especially those that did not inherit the existing structures and staff, of course, at least initially lack the capacity to deal with service delivery and fulfill all their other functions. So this is, of course, a drain on their ability to deliver services. And then, of course, the creation of these new local governments also occurs, on the basis of electoral considerations and not based on sound technical analysis. So there's never an evaluation that's done as to whether the new local government units are actually viable service delivery units from an operational point of view. Yeah, so these are the challenges, some of the challenges that the system faces. Now, I'd like to go back to the funding flows and the resources that local governments have available for service delivery. So this diagram provides a useful overview of the financing flows to local governments. As you can see, the size of the bars illustrate the relative size of the respective funding flows. And the diagram shows that, as I mentioned earlier, the conditional transfers are the most important funding source. They usually go from central government to the higher level government, which here refers to the main level of local government, which is the district or municipality. The discretionary funds, as I mentioned earlier, exist as well, but they're less important in terms of volume. And then there are the other government transfers or the subventions, which are used to finance particular programs such as disease-specific interventions, and they are often comprise on-budget donor funding. And then what is here meant as the external financing, these refers to donor funding that does not go through the national budget, so it's not on budget at the national level, but it goes through local governments, so it is on budget at the local level. Yeah, and as mentioned before, the own source revenues, again, contributions are very, very small, almost insignificant. This graph just gives you an idea of the importance of intergovernmental fiscal transfers as a share of the total budgeted expenditures per sector. Mostly to show that, so the service delivery is particularly at the local level, or the role of local governments in service delivery is particularly important in education, in health, where we have 22% of the overall budget is channeled through intergovernmental fiscal transfers. Here, the public administration bit also contains the unconditional recurrent transfers as well as discretionary development grants. So this is these are grants that could potentially be used in a range of sectors. And then there are minor roles in social development, public works and transport, water, and other economic sectors, which includes agriculture, for example, and trade and industry. All right. So, one thing to mention here, excuse me, is that Uganda has done a lot of work on consolidating and simplifying its intergovernmental fiscal transfer system over the last years. This is still work in progress, but the general aim is to have 3 grants per sector. So to have a wage grant, a non-wage recurrent grant, and development grant. And so previously there were dozens of, sometimes hundreds of different very small grants in each sector, which, of course, made things very complicated. And this is an issue that's been tackled. But as I said, it is still work in progress. And despite these efforts towards simplification, the fragmentation of funding is still present and results in a fairly complex system of financial flows, which I wanted to really illustrate again here on using the example of health service delivery. So this is a diagram shows the funding flows for self-health service delivery. And you can see there's many of them, they go to different actors. There is, of course, the funding from central government that goes directly to local governments through the intergovernmental fiscal transfer system. But then there's also funding that goes through the Ministry of Health to local governments or to health facilities. And this funding can either be on budget or it can be off budget, often donor funding off budget. And then there is also donor funding that goes through third-party implementers, such as either TA projects or NGOs, that remains completely off budget. And so this shows that it is, in fact, really difficult to know how many resources and for what purpose go exactly to the sector. Yes, and some of these, as I mentioned, some of these occur on the national budget, but and others on the local government budget, but not on the national budget, but some of them are. So it's quite a complex situation. So everything I just presented regarding the funding flows has, of course, important ramifications on local government planning and budgeting. As previously explained, most of the funding streams are tightly earmarked, so their use is predetermined. At the same time, the various funding streams are quite fragmented and not always complementary. In fact, there's actually no good way of to ensure that they are complementary. And this is all reinforced further by off-budget donor support, which is often given for very specific programs or purposes. So as a result, local government planning and budgeting often lacks coherence and is not based on local needs and priorities. In fact, there's no room for local governments to develop a strategic vision for what they want to achieve with their budget, because effectively allocations are simply driven by national and donor priorities. There's a lot of funding gaps due to very little discretionary funding. I mean, there is this discretionary or unconditional recurrent grant, but it's very, very small, and it's not sufficient to make sure that all the functions are really, or all the needed expenditures are covered. And then often there's also a very weak link between investment and operating budgets, because also this link isn't made on the national level. So the local government budgets often are very disjointed in a way. So this is one struggle. Another challenge due to the system of the way that the local government service delivery finance is organized, is also to the allocation, it's also with regards to the allocation, the resource allocation across different local governments. So the research we've done revealed great variations in resource allocations between local governments. So some local governments receiving considerably more transfers than others. This, of course, this has also been found to be further exacerbated by donor allocations. And we've even found evidence that this inequitable resource allocation might potentially create or exacerbate existing inequalities in service delivery. So I will show you some evidence to illustrate these points. First, with regards to the inequitable budget allocation. So this graph shows the per capita allocations across all 100 and, well, here it was still 175 local governments. And as you can see, there's a large variation from, let's say, maybe $10 per capita to almost 150. Which, okay, so that in itself does not necessarily have to be a problem if these variations in allocation serve to offset either weaker revenue capacity of certain local governments or try to mitigate existing inequities. However, we have seen that that's not really the case. So this graph here shows a correlation between those per capita allocations and the local government poverty rates. And as you can see, there is a negative correlation. So the higher local governments with higher poverty rates tend to receive a lower per capita allocation of resources, which is a little bit disconcerting, of course. Also, this effect is further reinforced by donor allocations, as I mentioned previously. This graph here illustrates that a little bit. So this is looking specifically on the health sector. We're looking at a non-wage recurrent transfers for each local government. And then on top, the donor allocations from the 6 most important health donors. I mean, in terms of their financial, the volume of their financial contribution. And as you can see, first of all, the dark blue are the non-wage recurrent allocations, which in themselves vary quite a bit. And then when you look at the donor allocations for each local government on top, yeah, there's really a great variation in allocations across local governments, and also a tendency to not offset the the inequalities of the central government, of the national government allocations, but to even exacerbate those. So you can see some of the districts or local governments that receive already quite a lot of a non-wage recurrent grant will also then are among those that receive the most donor allocations through the 6 largest donor funding streams. And this also has some ramifications for the equality in service delivery itself. So this graph here shows these are the 40 local governments with the lowest immunization rates and their respective allocations for non-wage recurrent intergovernmental transfers and the donor allocations on top. The green line here shows the local government average for non-wage recurrent, and you can see that among the 40 local governments with the lowest immunization rate, only 6 of them receive a non-wage recurrent grant that is above average. All the other 34 receive below average allocations. And the red line does the same, shows that the average for both non-wage recurrent and donor local government donor allocations combined. And here you can see again that out of the 40 local governments with the lowest immunization rates, only about, I think these are 9, so only about a quarter of them, just under a quarter of them receive above average allocations. So clearly when your local governments that are already fairly poorly off in terms of service delivery receive also few allocations, well, there's a clear correlation between the two, which yeah, is not so good. This graph, well, these two graphs basically drive home the same point. They demonstrate a correlation between the allocations of non-wage recurrent grants on the top left-hand side and the combination of non-wage recurrent and donor funding in the bottom right corner, with the local government standard unit of output in the health sector. So the standard unit of output is sort of a measure of service delivery used by the Ministry of Health. And as you can see, local governments with a more generous non-wage recurrent grant allocation do considerably better in their provide more units of output, more standard units of output, which, you know, of course, in itself is not necessarily a surprising finding, but it does demonstrate that you know, these inequities in resource allocation do matter for service delivery. Okay. A final challenge I wanted to discuss is the challenge, well, PFM challenge is that local governments experience with regards to budget execution. Here, these are challenges that you can read about in secondary literature. Some of it is also things that come out of various research that we've done. Here, one issue is that even though this has been, this issue has improved a lot, but still local governments are struggling with receiving funding quite late in the year. So there are late releases from central government. This is of course related to the way that the central government manages its cash. And even though that process has smoothed quite a bit, and there's also certain measures that were taken to assure that local governments get priority in releases, there's still a situation that not all the funds come through on time, especially towards the end of the year, which can be, of course, problematic for budget execution. Another big issue from a local government perspective is that local governments, due to the tight earmarking that I previously discussed, have very little to no discretion really to reallocate resources based on need over the course of the year. So when they see that certain funds are not coming through at a certain point, even though they would need them, they cannot use other funding to just, offset this lack. They just have to stick, each allocation needs to be used exactly for the use it's been intended for. So that also creates issues. There have been reported issues with procurement, both at local government level, but also at the national level. So I mentioned earlier that drug procurement was re-centralized and is now, there's a national agency under the Ministry of Health responsible for this, but still to this point, local governments frequently report issues with procurement of drugs, and that leads to drug stockouts. And finally, there's clearly a weakness in capacity with regards to managing investments or development grants. So yes, all these challenges in budget execution are then relate closely to challenges observed in service delivery, ranging from service interruptions, for example, as I mentioned, drug stockouts. There's also a weak implementation of investment projects, and quite an inefficient use and potentially a waste of scarce resources. Okay. To sum up, or as a final reflection, so what are the systematic issues that are driving all these PFM challenges of local governments? Our research has shown that a lot of this relates to the lack of transparency due to the fragmentation of funding that really impedes an overall coordination of resource allocation. I guess we're not arguing for all the funds to always go through national budget or through one single consolidated transfer system. There certainly are good reasons for special programs and for keeping certain funding streams separate. But what is important still is that these allocations are made, whether they're off budget or on budget, that they are being made transparent and sort of consolidated in one reporting system that allows to provide an overall view of the allocation situation, also with regards to the vertical, to the horizontal allocation of these resources, because otherwise no coordination can be done in that regard. Another systemic issue is certainly and continues to be the low PFM capacities of local staff, both at local government and facility level as well, including the poor familiarity with different systems and procedures, IFMIS, etc. That, of course, also contributes to issues, especially with budget execution. And then the overall resource scarcity, or the the adequacy of resource availability is, of course, also an issue. And over the last 10 years, it is clear that the health sector, for example, has been deprioritized at the very top of government in terms of when it comes to the sectoral allocations of funds over productive sectors like infrastructure and so on, which of course are also important. These are all at the end of the day political decisions, but yeah, the fact still remains that overall resource scarcity is of course an issue contributing to all these. And then finally, there are of course also political economy issues that drive some of these challenges. Not only, but certainly the attitude of the central government, or the position that the central government has taken towards local government, and the relative mistrust in their ability to properly manage local service delivery without very tight guidance from the top. So that certainly also plays into the mix. So I thank you for your attention. I hope I was able to give you a bit of a flavor of our latest findings on the PFM challenges in Uganda, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.